yourself in a second. Anyway, Karina, let me introduce her. She is also a recent PhD, very recently. Congratulations to you, Karina. Dr. Karina Moss, PhD in classical philology from the University of Cincinnati. Her dissertation explores themes from the Latin Elegies and Statius Thebaid, integrating her research interests of elegiac poetry, reception, intertextuality, and genre and gender studies. Her side projects include work on the Hesiodic Catalogue of Women and Propertius. And today, and I feel like we've really been building up to you, Karina, in many ways, where she's going to talk to us with a presentation entitled Teaching Lucretia, Addressing Sexual Violence as a Responsible Pedagogy. So take it away, Karina.
Thank you. And I do have a handout up on the website.
Yeah, forgive me. Yes, please go to the website to look at her beautiful handout that she's about to show us.
Yeah, so that's really a, it's designed to be a starting point. So take it, keep it, ask me questions about it. I refer to it, but it's definitely it's a guide for you. So I'd like to start today by thanking Joe and Hannah and my fellow panelists. It's been a long time since we sent in our abstracts for this conference, and the world looks pretty different. But I'm happy that we can all be here together today to talk about productive ways to deal with some pretty challenging topics. I also want to give a shout out to Charlotte Hunt, whose talk at the Our Voices conference in February preempted some of my thoughts today, and also to Ryan Pascoe, who I spoke with at the Hestia Roundtable in January, who also had had a very good conversation that started me thinking about this paper. My presentation today, as the title I hope indicates, covers some difficult subject matter, sexual assault and trauma primarily. Please check in with yourself, take a step away from the computer if you need to. Today, I'm going to talk about some of the difficulties surrounding the way we teach rape narratives in the college-level classics classroom and offer some suggestions. This is not a new topic, fortunately, and I include some, again, preliminary. This is not a comprehensive bibliography. It's very preliminary on the back of my handout, but people have been taking this topic seriously for a little while. And while we talk about the semester-length conversations that people have in myth classes or Ovid seminars, for example, we can lose sight of the fact that this is not the only place where these difficult stories appear. And I want to talk specifically about the story of Lucretia, which is one of the many rape narratives from antiquity, because in my experience, this has been the one story that keeps on appearing in isolated class units in courses ranging from history to civilization to introductory Latin, as we already heard mentioned today. For those who might be unfamiliar with Lucretia, her story comes to us from Livy's History of Ancient Rome, Urbe Condita, written around the end of the 1st century BCE. Livy describes why the early Romans threw off the oppressive rule of kings and turned to the consular system of government, the Republic, that would last over 500 years. In short, the son of the king became obsessed with Lucretia, who's the wife of a prominent elite Roman, because of her beauty and her modesty. And while her husband was away, Tarquin snuck into their home and tried to convince Lucretia to sleep with him. She refused and resisted every attempt. He finally threatened to rape her and then kill her, and then kill one of the men enslaved by the household, and arrange the two in bed together so that it would look like they had an affair. This final threat succeeds. After he leaves, Lucretia calls her husband and her father home. She tells them what had happened and makes them swear to take vengeance against Tarquin and his father the king on her behalf. She then kills herself, swearing that she cannot live as an example to Roman women. One of the men in the entourage is Brutus, who takes her bloody dagger and riles up the people to attack and overthrow the Tarquins. He, along with Lucretia's husband, become the first consuls of Rome. And his descendant is the Brutus who assassinates Caesar in Livy's own historical time. This story is replicated in a variety of Renaissance art and throughout Roman history textbooks. A highly abridged version of it, however, appears in Wheelock, which is a standard introductory Latin textbook that we've already heard a little bit about earlier today. And this is the genesis of my paper. In fall of 2015, as a third-year graduate student, I was teaching my first class as instructor of record, Intro Latin using Wheelock. Chapter 7 of the 40 chapters in this textbook has the story of Lucretia's rape and suicide. And I've copied out the Latin for reference on the handout, and I also include an image of the following page, which has a replication of a painting. So this is the way that the text is delivered and not contextualized to the students. So as a graduate student language instructor, I was part of a team with 2 other grad students teaching the other course sections and an assigned faculty mentor. We were given Wheelock and an overall schedule for the semester's progress, but our daily assignments and class activities were self-structured. And when scheduling this chapter, I decided to avoid the passage on Lucretia, as I wasn't sure that I would feel comfortable teaching it. Instead, I assigned a translation from one of our supplemental resource books. And when we came into class that day, that Monday, prepared to go over this assignment, one of my students raised his hand to say that he was bored at work over the weekend with no entertainment beyond his Latin homework, and he had read the entire chapter. What, he said, was going on with that story about Lucretia? Can we talk about it? So when my student opens class asking for a discussion, I'm not going to say no. So there went my planning for the day. I was surprised and unprepared to talk about the story, but my class was 7 students and we were forging a pretty strong bond. Honestly, I barely remember what I said, but it started with me saying, okay, we're going to come back to the homework tomorrow and do the story today. It's short, so we sight read it together and then had a discussion for half of the class before moving on to the other material that I was obligated to work through. For Wednesday, our following class period, I sent my students in advance a translation of the full story from Livy, along with some discussion questions. And we spent another 15 to 20 minutes on the topic before continuing with the chapter material. For as much as I had been unprepared in the moment, I was lucky to have a toolbox for having a conversation about this passage, thanks to a lunchtime seminar my department had offered the year prior on teaching difficult material. I knew it would take a lot of energy for me to do the story justice, but having to teach it on the fly essentially was even worse. And you can tell that this has stayed with me. And I've thought a lot since then about the space we give conversations about sexual violence in the classics classroom. In a course on elegy, a seminar in women in antiquity, or a myth class, we can and should, I believe, expect a conversation at the start of the semester about the sexual violence in the course material and what the students and the instructor can expect from the material and from each other. That then becomes a framework for an ongoing conversation throughout the course. It is with this sort of scenario, as I noted earlier, that the majority of scholarship on this topic has occurred. And I want to acknowledge and emphasize the wealth and importance of this material. But there's fewer conversations about dealing with and teaching the violence of antiquity when you don't have the framework of an entire semester at your back. How do you teach a single day's worth of material, such as this story, in a language class, where the focus is not even on culture and context? You have one class period, if that. You have to move through the material. You don't have tenure. Your materials have been assigned. You have to reach certain milestones in the class. So how do you prepare your students for their one day of Lucretia? And how do you talk about her in class in a way that's respectful to the material and to your students? Well, this is the impetus of my work today. This discussion is, I hope, relevant more broadly. For example, I used a similar framework in my later Roman history and Roman civilization courses. And the overall point also is about teaching consciously as much as it is a discussion for teaching Lucretia specifically. So why is this story in particular a potential problem? I'd like to borrow language from the world of trauma-informed pedagogy. Trauma-informed pedagogy rests on the foundation that our students may have experienced trauma. If we teach them material that might explore subjects of trauma, that may be intimately familiar to them, and we must practice our pedagogy with this in mind. When an event becomes a trauma, the human brain wires it differently. Typically, memory is recorded in a linear narrative, and then it's remembered in a linear narrative. Traumatic events are recorded in a different place that excerpts the trauma from that linear narrative of your life. And when memory of trauma is triggered, the brain recalls this distinct traumatic memory. This is why a flashback is difficult to break out of, because it's stored separately. Trigger or content warnings are often used to indicate material that may cause someone distress if they have endured trauma related to a similar experience. I tend to prefer saying content warnings because of the disinformation campaign that was waged against the phrase trigger warnings. It amounts to the same thing, but it tends to be heard a little clearer by everyone in the room. That all said, someone doesn't need to have experienced related trauma in order to find a story disturbing. I've never been in a war zone, but I can't watch war movies. When we read the story of Lucretia, we're reading a narrative of sexual assault and suicide. Those are not exclusive to antiquity. Many individuals in our classrooms and among our peers may have personal experience with that particular kind of violence. And it may be intensely difficult to read this story or to have a conversation about it because of that familiarity.